So this is just the second section of the nervous system then, and in this part we're going to be looking at synapses and the reflex arc. Now, in the first video, we talked about how a stimulus gets detected, there's a stimulus, it gets detected by the receptors, it sends an impulse to the coordinator, to the effector, and then we carry out a response. Now, as well as that, we added this extra bit of information where we said the names of some neurons involved. So we said that a sensory neuron carries an impulse from the receptor to the coordinator. Within the coordinator, you find an association neuron, and between the coordinator and effector, there is a motor neuron. Now, the part we're looking at here is synapses. Now, a synapse is basically a gap between two neurons which act as junctions. Okay, so this sensory neuron doesn't connect directly with the association neuron. It actually travels along here, and then when it's in the coordinator, there'll be a little gap, then the association neuron, then another little gap, and then a motor neuron which will go to the effector. So these little gaps here between the neurons are called synapses. Now, I'm going to show you how a synapse works, and we're also going to talk about why they're important. So, as we say, they are gaps between neurons. It allows connections to be made, and it's particularly important in the brain where millions of sensory and motor neurons end and originate. So end and start. So by having these synapses, it allows lots of different neurons to connect with other neurons. So lots of different messages can be sent around the body at the same time. Now, the nerve impulses can pass because there is a transmitter chemical which diffuses from the end of the neuron leading into the synapse. Now, this transmitter, you may have heard of before, is called a neurotransmitter, and these are only found in synapses. When the concentration is high enough, an impulse is triggered in one neuron to the next one. Synapses may slow transmission, but they allow a greater degree of control at these junction points. So this animation just shows a little synapse. So it is a gap between two neurons. So this part here is the synapse. This is one neuron. This is another neuron. And things moving from here to here by diffusion are neurotransmitters. So a synapse then is a gap between two neurons which allows a neurotransmitter to diffuse across. Now this is what it looks like. So this is the direction the impulse is traveling. So it's going to go from this one, let's call this A, to B. Now, these little things are neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are the little triangles held in little vesicles. Now, vesicles are just little sacs which are found within cells. So the neurotransmitter is held within these little sacs. What happens is, when the impulse comes along, so the impulse comes along, the neurotransmitter moves to the membrane, and then it gets released. If that is not how you spell released, it gets released into the gap, and then it diffuses, and the next little part is that it joins on with these little receptor sites. So it attaches to the receptors. Now, the reason why these neurotransmitters will fit into these receptor sites is because they have a complementary shape, which you might remember from enzymes means they have a shape that matches each other. And then, if enough neurotransmitter diffuses across, that allows the electrical impulse to carry on along this way. And that's how a synapse works. So moving on then. All of our actions can be split up into voluntary actions or reflex actions. So a voluntary action is one that we choose to do, and it usually involves the brain as the coordinator. Whereas reflex actions don't involve us thinking about them. They're usually automatic and there's a rapid response. We know they're happening, but we can't do anything to stop them. Now, have a little think about these ones. See if you think that these ones are voluntary or reflex actions. Now, when we're thinking of these, just think about them most of the time. So, most of the time, would you think about blinking or think about swallowing? Obviously, you can control that, but in general, you don't think about doing it. So those two are reflex actions. And here's the rest of them. Then one of the most well-known reflex actions is the withdrawal reflex. So this is basically produced in response to pain. You don't think about it. So when, for example, part of your body feels pain, it will withdraw or pull away from danger really quickly. So the example would be if you're walking around your house with no shoes on and you step on like something really sharp like a plug or a bit of Lego or something, you automatically lift your foot because it's really, really painful and it stops any further damage happening. But the amazing thing about this is all that happens and there's only 3 neurons involved. A sensory, association and a motor neuron, and they form the reflex arc. Now this is the reflex arc here. So the reflex arc is only really used in response to pain or heat. So this is basically what happens. Now it follows the trend that we've got. So there's a stimulus, there's a receptor, there's a coordinator, there's an effector, and there's a response. So let's say, for example, in this one, they're touching something very, very hot. Okay, so the stimulus is the heat. What happens is the stimulus is detected by the receptor. The receptor is the skin in this case. It sends a signal along the sensory neuron. I'll just show that again. So it sends an impulse up the sensory neuron. And then that neuron goes up to the coordinator, which in this case is going to be the spinal cord because it's rapid. And then it travels across the association neuron, where it will go to the motor neuron, and then it will go to the effector, which is going to be, so the impulse travels down the motor neuron, and then the effector is going to be the hand muscles, and the response is that you drop the hot object or lift your arm. Okay, now let's look at that again. So, as I say, there's a stimulus, which is the heat. The stimulus gets detected by the receptor. The receptors send an impulse along the sensory neuron. It reaches the coordinator and travels along the relay neuron or the association neuron. It then travels from the association neuron to the motor neuron, which travels down to the effector. And then the effector, which is the muscles, contract, release the pan, and that's your response. So this just shows it again then. So the stimulus is the heat. The receptors in the skin detect it. They send an impulse along the sensory neuron up into the coordinator, which is the spinal cord. It then goes from the sensory neuron to the association neuron, travels across the association neuron, then it reaches the motor neuron, and then the impulse travels down the motor neuron to the effector, which is the muscle in the arm, and this muscle contracts and lifts your arm out of danger. Now, just in your notes here, it would be good to just show where each of these neurons is. So we've got a sensory neuron, we've got an association neuron, and we also have a motor neuron. So if we mark on the sensory neuron first, it goes from the receptors up into the spinal cord, where it joins with the association neuron, and then it joins on with the motor neuron, which goes to the effectors. This next wee diagram just shows how everything works. So we've basically got here number 1, which is the stimulus. It's detected by the receptors, which is in your fingers. It sends an impulse along this, which is the sensory neuron. It then travels across a synapse, which is here. So this is number 3, it's number 4. Goes to the association neuron, which is number 5. It then travels across another synapse, and then travels down the motor neuron, which is number 6, down to the effector, which is number 7. And this is a summary of it. So the stimulus is a hot object. The pain receptors are stimulated. They send an impulse along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Now it's the spinal cord usually in the reflex arc because it has to be fast. The impulse travels across the synapse. The impulse travels along the association neuron and then to another synapse. The impulse then travels along the motor neuron and then it goes to the effector. The biceps contract, it lifts your arm, and that is the response. Now, just to try and test your knowledge here, try and put these in the right order. So you literally just need to write out what order these should go in. Pause it here, give it a try. So the correct order then is this. Stimulus is the hot object. Pain receptors are stimulated. The sensory neuron carries the impulse to the spinal cord, which is the coordinator. The impulse travels across the synapse. Then it goes across the association neuron and then another synapse. It travels to the motor neuron and then finally goes to the biceps, which contracts and it lifts your arm.